I guess one way to jump in, I think I would like to hear kind of your, I guess, sense of American culture right now in terms of our attitude toward death. Like, how would you describe it? How is death thought of and dealt with in America?
Mm-hmm. When it's thought of and dealt with, which is actually kind of a big, thing as people think about culture and how it relates to death and dying. I mean, one of the sort of things that's been remarked upon by a million people is that generally in the West and in America, we don't like to think or talk about death in the first place. We tend to put it out of mind as much as possible, which means that sort of for many of us, when we reach the end of life, if we're sort of dealing with the decisions that ultimately come or thinking about how we're going to care for our family members, the first discussion that happens is kind of at a crucial point of decision, which is not always a good time to have the conversation. But, just broadly in our culture, I think there's this interesting phenomenon. For a long time, it was said in our culture that death was taboo, that it was something you didn't really talk about. And this all really began to change with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and what came to be known as the death awareness movement. She wrote this book, sort of foundational book on grief. And this was in sort of the 1960s, 1970s. Things began to come out in the open a little bit. Mm-hmm. And now, there are bestsellers about death and dying. Atul Gawande's Being Mortal, Paul Kalanithe's When Breath Becomes Air. You get movies dealing with end-of-life issues more and more. So there's a sense in which the sort of taboo nature is maybe lessening. And yet I was thinking about this recently. There was a famous sociologist named Jeffrey Gorer who wrote an article in the 1950s called The Pornography of Death, in which he was sort of making the argument that the way Victorian societies dealt with sex as a taboo was being mirrored in the way 1950s American culture was dealing with death as a taboo. And the way you know that something is taboo is that when it comes out into the open, it comes out in a sort of sensationalized way, a way that's separated from any sense of normalcy or quotidian, and only is sort of thought about in hypersensualized ways. You could think about that in terms of pornography very easily, but in his time it was sort of horror books and ultimately films. And I do think that there's still really a sense in which when we encounter death and dying, most often it's in a sensationalized way that is really divorced from any real life emotions and relationships, and we get it in video games and movies and violence and things like that. So I think that there is still a sense in which we have a long way to go becoming comfortable bringing death into the open.